Welcome to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Fribourg. Just a quick note before we dive in, you can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify for a small monthly amount. It really helps keep the show going and gives you access to some extra episodes. There's a link in the description. Okay, so today we're diving deep into, well, one of the most compelling and, frankly, continually tested ideas in modern political thought, Francis Fukuyama's End of History thesis.
Right. It was first put forward back in 1989, right as the Berlin Wall was coming down. And Fukuyama made this really bold suggestion that liberal democracy and market capitalism represented the final inevitable destination for humanity's sociopolitical evolution.
Exactly. But in the decades since, global events, everything from democratic backsliding to new geopolitical rivalries, they've pushed back hard against that assertion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the tension.
Yeah.
My argument today is going to be that recent events, while, certainly challenging, they actually underscore the enduring relevance of Fukuyama's core insights. What we're witnessing, I believe, are largely challenges within the liberal democratic framework, not its fundamental refutation.
And I'm going to contend that the current global landscape presents truly compelling evidence that Fukuyama's vision was, well, let's say at best premature and maybe at worst fundamentally flawed. We're seeing deep contradictions emerging that liberal democracy and capitalism, as they're currently structured, are really struggling, perhaps even failing to resolve.
Okay, so let's lay out the initial positions. Fukuyama's original thesis, positing Western liberal democracy as the final socioeconomic stage, it really emerged from that profound historical moment, didn't it? The fall of the Berlin Wall, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. It genuinely felt like a coherent political aspiration had sort of triumphed globally. Now, I know many point to democratic backsliding today, and you see it with figures like Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or, movements like Trump's MAGA in the U.S. However, Fukuyama himself actually anticipated things like this. He described them as a kind of death rattle of authoritarianism. He noted that even regimes that have fallen back into autocracy, places like Iran or North Korea, they often still maintain the trappings of democracy. A constitution, a parliament, elections, however much of a sham they might be.
Mm-hmm.
And the global dominance of capitalism, that further reinforces this point. Anti-capitalist ideologies are, well, for the most part, relegated to the fringe, aren't they? Even overtly anti-democratic states understand they need to kind of scramble to hold fake elections. Why? Because they tacitly acknowledge the democratic mandate as the recognized source of legitimate authority in the modern international system. So when we see things like the rise of the radical alternative for Germany, the AfD, fueled by, say, immigration debates, or our rejection of the excesses of wokeness in America, these strike me as issues within liberal democracy. They're not fundamental contradictions that are going to lead to its collapse, but rather problems. Serious problems, sure, but ones that can be resolved through political means, through negotiation, adaptation.
Fukuyama's argument, remember, also leaned heavily on the logic of modern natural science, driving economic development towards capitalism. And crucially, humanity's desire for recognition, what he called thymos, ultimately finding its most rational and universal satisfaction in the reciprocal recognition offered by liberal states. And that underlying mechanism for progress, especially the economic aspect, it still largely holds, I think.
Okay, well, I come at it from a very different perspective, because when I look at the contemporary global landscape, end of history feels like a phrase describing, well, a fantasy, really. I truly believe it has been decisively proven wrong by the current state of affairs. We're not just seeing temporary blips. True democracies are teetering, and perhaps more worryingly, organized groups that want to burn down the house of liberal democracy, they're becoming genuinely competitive. This is far, far more than mere backsliding. The rise of far-right nativist parties like Germany's AfD, tapping into these deep anxieties about immigration and national identity, and the whole Trump phenomenon rejecting what it labels wokeness, they highlight just how profoundly vulnerable liberal democracies are to internal divisions and, let's be honest, sometimes humanity's worst instincts. And we really shouldn't overlook the internet's role here.
It has fundamentally altered the information landscape. It's made these inconvenient truths about capitalist liberal democracies. Think about things like regime change operations, war crimes, atrocities against indigenous peoples, so much easier to access and disseminate globally. And this naturally erodes trust in institutions. It weakens nations internally. Meanwhile, more authoritarian countries can often, keep their dirt under wraps, maintaining at least a facade of stability. And crucially, the China model presents a powerful counter-narrative to Fukuyama's idea of universality. It shows a clear path of economic development and increasing global influence without adopting Western liberal democracy. The historical record also strongly suggests that the U.S., often under the guise of promoting democracy, has launched wars wantonly and tried to export democracy by force, frequently protecting a financial oligarchy's interest at the cost of other nations' stability. That baffler commentary, I think, rightly points out Fukuyama's maybe omission of U.S. foreign policy and this imperial adventurism, which led directly to failed projects of nation-building in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. These actions, they directly undermined liberal principles, curtailing rights and legitimizing interventionism in ways that frankly make a mockery of universal ideals.
Okay, I understand that interpretation, especially given the very real anxieties we see playing out in nations from, Denmark to Germany and across the Atlantic. But my concern is that we might be conflating problems with fundamental contradictions. The rise of nationalist or populist movements, while absolutely concerning and requiring serious attention, yes, they often attach themselves to what many people perceive as ill-fated decisions of governments, whether that's specific immigration policies, maybe in Germany, or certain cultural shifts happening in America. These, in my view, are policy failures or perhaps profound societal shifts that can, eventually, be addressed within the robust, flexible framework of liberal democracy. They are not, I would argue, inherent systemic flaws that are threatening to dismantle the system itself.
Fukuyama himself was quite careful, actually, to distinguish between problems and contradictions. He suggested that a problem only becomes a contradiction, in that sort of Hegelian sense, if it corrodes the system's legitimacy to the point of collapse. Now, while challenged by these movements, the fundamental legitimacy of universal rights and market economics has not in these nations actually collapsed. In fact, these ideals still remain aspirational for populations globally, even for those who are protesting within the system. So while you point to deep discontent, and it's there, I see societies grappling with difficult issues through the very mechanisms of liberal debate and electoral politics.
I have to respectfully disagree there. While you frame these as problems, the sheer magnitude and pervasiveness of the current democratic backsliding, coupled with this palpable erosion of trust in institutions fueled by those readily available inconvenient truths about state actions, it suggests something far more profound to me. When democracies are genuinely described as teetering, and when organized groups that want to burn down the house of liberal democracy are actually competitive electorally, it indicates a deeper source of social discontent that is simply not being sufficiently resolved within the existing system. This, to my mind, absolutely reaches the level of a Hegelian contradiction, where the very tensions within the system are so fundamental they actively threaten its stability and its coherence. The rise of the far right, often fed by very legitimate concerns of economic insecurity among working-class populations in the West, points directly to systemic failures of capitalism itself to deliver on its promise of prosperity for everyone. That's creating internal fissures that liberalism is really struggling to contain. It's not just about specific policy missteps anymore. It feels like it's about a widening gap between the promise of liberal prosperity and the lived reality for a significant number of people. And if a system cannot address the material well-being of a large portion of its citizenry, that isn't just a problem. It's a fundamental challenge to its legitimacy.
I understand that argument, and the economic anxieties are certainly real and need addressing. But to pivot slightly, let's consider the universality of liberalism versus the supposed challenge of alternative models like China. While the China model has undeniably achieved remarkable economic growth,
and it certainly holds sway in its region, it hasn't, in my opinion, presented a universally appealing political ideology that truly supplants the liberal ideal on a global scale. I mean, even vocally anti-democratic states like China, Russia, North Korea, they still engage in what we might call fake elections. They maintain these trappings of democracy, things like a national assembly or a constitution. Now, this to me underscores the intrinsic appeal and the perceived legitimacy of the democratic ideal itself, even if it's not genuinely practiced in those places. It shows that even authoritarians feel compelled to pay lip service to democratic forms.
But is that enough?
Well, and furthermore, Fukuyama himself, he eventually distanced himself from the excessive militarism and embrace of unilateral armed intervention of neoconservatism that marked some U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War. He advocated instead for what he called a realistic Wilsonianism. That is, promoting values through example, through international institutions, rather than primarily through force. This was his way, I think, of acknowledging the internal fallibility of the U.S. and the critical importance of its own conduct in upholding liberal principles, rather than abandoning the core idea that liberal democracy is the most desirable form of government. The failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, while tragic and deeply problematic, don't necessarily invalidate the ideal itself. They highlight the immense difficulties, or perhaps even the hubris, involved in trying to impose it forcefully.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the trappings of democracy argument holds much water against the substantive challenge presented by models like China. Saying that authoritarian states merely play pretend with democracy, it really overlooks the fact that the China model prioritizes things like stability, the collective good, national sovereignty over Western-defined individual democratic freedoms. And its undeniable economic success, its increasing geopolitical influence, provide a powerful, tangible counter-narrative to the kind of universality Fukuyama once posited. It clearly shows that there are alternative paths to power and prosperity, or at least paths perceived as such by many. Moreover, the U.S.'s imperial adventurism post-Cold War, launching wars in places like Iraq, Kosovo, Afghanistan under the, guise of democracy, it didn't just undermine its conduct, it fundamentally undermined the credibility of liberal ideals themselves on the global stage. These actions were widely perceived, rightly or wrongly, as prioritizing selfish U.S. motives and financial interests, not genuine democratic promotion. This isn't just a problem of excessive militarism or a misapplication of principles. It feels like a fundamental hypocrisy that weakens the universal claim of liberal democracy to be the endpoint of history. It reveals that the logic of modern natural science doesn't inevitably lead to political liberty when power is applied in such a, self-serving manner. How can an ideal remain universal when its most powerful proponent so often appears to act against its own stated values, particularly in international relations?
That's a sharp point about the credibility gap created by perceived hypocrisy, and it's certainly a valid criticism of certain periods of U.S. foreign policy, no doubt. However, let's explore another aspect that Fukuyama himself really grappled with, Nietzsche's last man critique. You mentioned anxieties earlier about a rejection of the excesses of wokeness and this potential societal ennui. The challenges we observe, like, say, a perceived decline in work ethic or the fragmentation of cultural discourse, they often relate to a fundamental tension within liberal society itself, this balance between universal equality and the individual's inherent desire for recognition, or thymos, that innate human longing for dignity, for being seen and valued beyond just material comfort. Nietzsche famously warned of the last man, these individuals content with just comfortable self-preservation, lacking striving, becoming, as he rather bleakly put it, men without chests. Fukuyama considered this deeply. However, I would argue that liberal societies, even with all their flaws, still offer diverse and pretty robust outlets for ambitious natures. This happens through electoral politics, through entrepreneurial striving, scientific innovation, and even, as Fukuyama noted regarding Japan, through seemingly contentless formal arts. The ongoing intense debates we have today, even if they sometimes seem petty or overly focused on identity politics, are arguably manifestations of this very thymotic drive being channeled and contained within the system. People are still striving for recognition, even if it's through new, maybe sometimes unfamiliar forms of social and political engagement. It shows the desire for recognition, though perhaps sometimes misdirected, continues to find expression within the liberal framework.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that maybe the last man critique, far from being some minor tension, actually points to a critical weakness that might be foundational? I mean, if liberalism's commitment to universal equality in its very pursuit of universal recognition actually leads to a kind of creeping mediocrity and a society of men without chests, where relativism discourages strong belief in any one doctrine, well, doesn't it risk stripping individuals of the proud self-assertiveness that's necessary for a robust, dynamic society? Consider the argument about the decline of community life, not despite liberal principles, but precisely because of them, as some have argued. This suggests that liberalism, maybe in its purer form, could unintentionally undermine the more irrational forms of thymos, things like fierce patriotism, a strong communal work ethic, or deep religious community, that are arguably essential for its own stability and dynamism. Without these more foundational, sometimes maybe irrational sources of self-worth and belonging, Fukuyama himself worried, didn't he, that this could lead men to struggle against the just cause out of sheer boredom, seeking conflict and identity even within conditions of peace and material prosperity. And when we look at the rise of tribalism and identity politics across the globe today, it seems to suggest that people are indeed seeking meaning and recognition in ways that traditional liberalism maybe doesn't adequately provide, pointing to a potentially profound vulnerability in the thesis of a wholly satisfying end of history.
Well, today's discussion has truly illuminated the complexities surrounding Francis Fukuyama's End of History thesis. It's a concept that clearly continues to spark vigorous debate in international relations and political philosophy. From my perspective, while liberal democracies certainly face significant internal and external pressures, many of which we've discussed today, from populism to geopolitical competition, these are largely, I still think, problems that can and are being addressed within the existing framework. I would maintain that the underlying principles of liberal democracy and market capitalism remain the most coherent and widely aspirational ideals for humanity, with even non-democratic states ultimately paying homage to them through those various trappings of democracy.
My view, however, as we've explored, contends that contemporary global events, from the rise of authoritarian populism, the powerful challenge of alternative models like China's, to the internal erosion of trust due to past actions, and the very real potential for a last man's societal ennui, I think these reveal deeper contradictions. These challenges, I believe, fundamentally destabilize the notion of history having reached its end, suggesting that the journey is well far from over and perhaps diverging down entirely new, quite unpredictable paths.
It is absolutely clear that the global political landscape continues to evolve in fascinating and often unpredictable ways, and that invites all of us to critically examine the assumptions of past theories and to actively engage with the unfolding present. There is certainly much more to explore in the ongoing history of our world, and we encourage our listeners to consider these perspectives as they observe the significant issues shaping international relations, international politics, and indeed, national politics in places like Denmark and well beyond. Today, thank you for joining us for this debate. We hope it's offered you some new perspectives. Don't forget to follow Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Fribourg wherever you listen to podcasts. And please, if you enjoyed it, consider giving us 5 stars. Your ratings really do help us reach even more listeners interested in these vital discussions.